You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to ProveText and Glossa House TV. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with one of my literary heroes, Nancy Pearcey, Professor Nancy Pearcey. I'm really excited about this, been looking forward to it for a while. And Professor Pearcey has written numerous books. I think the first one I remember reading back in some of my seminary days was Total Truth. And she's got a new book out that deals with the toxic war on masculinity, and you can get that at places like Amazon and other places. So I'm really looking forward to this. Professor Pearcey, it's nice to meet you, and thank you for, we had some technical difficulties leading up to this point, but we got it working. So it's good to meet you. Thanks for coming on and talking today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yes. Well, I want to talk about the new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and I have a lot of questions, but let's just start with the most basic one. What inspired you to write this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and does it build on your previous works, and if so, how?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, the reason I decided to write it is because I was really struck with the way it's become socially acceptable to attack men. Here's an example. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really? This is now at the level of a mainstream publication like the Washington Post? The Huffington Post had an editor who tweeted hashtag "kill all men," and then said it was just a joke. I don't think it's a funny joke. And speaking of jokes, you can buy t-shirts that say things like, "So many men, so little ammunition." And there are books that have come out with very blunt titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" And the real tragedy is that even men are jumping on the bandwagon. A male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then there's one that you probably saw. This one was more recent, so it's not actually in the book. But the director of the movie Avatar was in the news saying testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So this is what I wanted to explain. You know, I write books on apologetics, but this is a little different stance because I'm doing sort of a cultural apologetics, wanting to explain where's this coming from. You know, where did it originate? Why does the secular culture get masculinity so wrong? And how can we give a biblical answer?
Yeah. In your book, you're critiquing sort of this modern cultural narrative around masculinity. I was wondering if you could elaborate on some of the main issues that you're seeing with how masculinity is currently being portrayed.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the saddest things is that boys are falling behind at all levels of education. This is the impact, I think, partly of the denigration of masculinity, is that boys start feeling like they're falling behind in kindergarten because they don't have the same fine motor control that girls have, so they can't use the scissors as well. And it's already in kindergarten, they're falling behind all the way through grade school, high school. They're falling behind in terms of both test scores and homework assigned, grades. Then in college, I teach at the college level. The average now is 60% female students and 40% male. So more and more women are graduating. And by the way, same thing in graduate school. Graduate school, like law and medicine, is now mostly women, more women than men. And then when they become adults, men are falling behind on all sorts of measures as well. Men are more likely, compared to women and compared to where men used to be. Men are doing worse in terms of suicide, drug addiction, homelessness, mental illness, crime. I used to work for Prison Fellowship, an international prison ministry, and we knew more than 90% of prison inmates are male. And life expectancy. This one was a bit of a surprise because this is the first time ever, since the start of the modern world, that life expectancy has gone down. Not for women; theirs has stayed the same.
Wow.
Only male life expectancy has gone down. So that an article called The New Scientist, a magazine called The New Scientist, had an article in which they said the major cause of early death now is being male. So I think it's time for us to have a little compassion on men and ask, what impact is this having to have a culture that is so hostile to masculinity? I do quote a woman, she's a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, you see it especially with younger men. She said, the young men coming into my practice are increasingly depressed and demoralized because they do feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. So I think it's time that we looked at some solutions that if we can't just let this ride anymore. Oh, here's one final stat. I just saw this yesterday. We are the first generation where sons are turning out to be less educated than their fathers.
Wow.
Yes. So this is definitely something we need to bring a biblical perspective on and see whether, as we can be salt and light in our culture on this issue.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As you look in the last, I don't know, several years, it seems to have amped up this like transgenderism, and I'm wondering like, it's sort of like the feminization of masculinity, right? Men sort of charading around as women predominantly. I mean, there are some women, acting as though they're men, but I'm I'm curious, like, about the connection between masculinity and that. You have any insights on that?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the transgender activists denigrate biology. The idea is that we need to escape our biology, that there's something wrong about being male or female. Transgender activists argue explicitly that your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological identity, with your body, with your anatomy. And so I think that it has an incredibly damaging impact on anyone, male or female, to be told that your body is not part of your authentic self. A BBC had a documentary in which they said that at the core of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And in that war, it's the mind that wins, right? BBC also put out it's called BBC Social, and it's for teenagers. And it featured a young woman who identified as non-binary. And she said, it doesn't matter what meat skeleton you've been born in. What matters is how you feel. So the body has been denigrated or demoted to just a meat skeleton. And I think that you're absolutely right. That has to have a big part of why men in particular are feeling like there's something, that the identity has nothing to do with their biological sex.
Yeah.
And that even that sex is somehow a limiting factor. Let me give you a positive example. So one of the examples that I have in my book, it's in my other book actually, Love Thy Body, but it's a young man who was homosexual, and he, interestingly enough, he grew up in a gay affirming family, as he calls it, and attended a gay affirming church. So he didn't think there was anything wrong with homosexuality. Today he's married and has 3 kids. And you say, well, why did he change then? And here's how he explains it. He says, I've decided to take my identity not from my feelings, but from my body. Your feelings can change, and they often do. But your body is empirically knowable fact that does not change. And here's how he put it. He said, I decided, I didn't try to change my feelings, which rarely works. But what I did is I decided to take to accept my body as a good gift from God. That's how he put it. To accept my body as a good gift from God. And he said, eventually my feelings started to change. And as I said, not only is he married today, but he's a Christian ethics professor in London. But I thought that was a very good insight he had, that he said, I should take my identity from my body, as a good gift from God, and not something that's somehow negative, some kind of limitation on my identity, but that it is a good gift and I should accept it and respect my body and live in harmony with my body, live in tune with the Creator's design.
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, you give a historical overview of masculinity, and I'm curious about you've touched on some of them, but what are some of the most significant changes in societal expectations of men that you've picked up on, that you've identified?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because most people think the attack on masculinity started maybe in the 1960s, second wave feminism. But what surprised me is when I went back in history, it starts much earlier. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Before that, men worked with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the social expectations on men focused much more on their caretaking role, on their responsibility for their family. That the good man is the good father, and not only of his own family, but it was very common back then to speak of fathers of the community.
Right.
That as you practice your fathering skills, you also brought them out into your church, school, civil society. So the expectation on men, in fact, the very term authority had a very specific meaning back then. Today we kind of have a negative view of authority as, I get to do what I want. But back then, it meant that you were not allowed to consider your own personal interest. If you had authority, say for the family, that meant you were supposed to be disinterested. Oh, that's an older word, but it meant you don't look out for your own interest. You were supposed to be looking out for the interest of the whole. And so the question is, how did we lose these expectations? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. Men had to follow their work, obviously, out of the home into offices and factories. And for the first time, men were not working with their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And you can see how that would be a very different environment. And that's when the literature starts to change. That's when you see people start to protest and say that men are losing that caretaking ethos of the earlier age, that they were becoming egocentric, competitive, self-interested, aggressive, ambitious. This kind of, and what surprised me is you can see this in the 19th century, they would often use the word idol, that men were turning their career into an idol. Instead of seeing their career primarily as a way to take care of the family, provide for their family, they were seeing individual economic success as the goal, as the most important thing. So it was fascinating that we talk about people who live for their job today, but it started back in the 19th century when people complained that men were starting to make their career into an idol. And of course, that does kind of tell us the solution too is, can we reconnect men to their families? Can we help them to once again, I think they need to take on that caretaking ethos again and define masculinity more in terms of rich, deep engagement with their families and communities.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you had done prison ministry, and that 90% of inmates are men, and that's affected every demographic, but especially like the African American community. And it seems like when you don't have men around, right, then there's sort of a feminization of the home in a sense, and that would seem to have major ramifications or effects on the children growing up in a fatherless home that's become, just has that sort of maybe feminine side to it. So I'm wondering about the connection between, or is there a connection between those incarceration rates and the sort of feminization of the home and men and this sort of thing?
Yeah, well, incarceration rates are part of it, but it's even bigger than that. 40% of American children are now growing up disconnected from their natural fathers. living apart from them, and in many cases not interacting with them at all. 40%. It is the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. What a thing to be the highest of. Single parenthood. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. It affects girls too, but not as much, because at least most of the time girls have a mother figure, in the home to kind of tell them what it means to be a woman. But the father figure is gone. But it started with the Industrial Revolution. We're so used to fathers being out of the home, for work, that we no longer realize that at the time it was experienced as traumatic. If you read the literature of the day, I'll give you some examples. 1842, Parents Magazine had an article in which they said, the greatest issue of our day is father absence. Paternal neglect is the actual word they use. Paternal neglect. They said the father labors, late and early and has no time to fulfill his duties to his children. And the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, many historians say was the most influential woman of the 19th century. And she wrote a book in which she said, the issue of our day is fathers being out of the home. And here's how she put it. She said, God is our father, and yet the prototype of the divine is absent from home from Sunday to Sunday. They didn't have Saturdays yet. From Sunday to Sunday, the father's gone. And they said, they just felt like the family had been gutted. So even though technically fathers were still in the home, which they are less likely to be today, even just working full-time was such a change that sociologists today, looking back, say things like, this is when boys experienced their first identity crisis. That's how one sociologist puts it. Another one a historian puts it this way. He said, boys for the first time were alienated from the world of adult men, because obviously it's through their father that they primarily related to, what it means to be a man. So I think we have to trace it, all the way back to the Industrial Revolution and ask, even in our industrial age, are there ways that we can maybe flex the workplace a bit and allow fathers to be more involved with their kids? Millennials, in surveys, say they want that. They want a better balance, they'd like it if both parents could work part-time and be home part-time. But even the pandemic made a difference. Harvard University did a study, and again, this is so recent, it's not in my book, but Harvard University did a study, and here's what their conclusion. During the pandemic, 65% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. They would prefer to keep some sort of hybrid arrangement, flexible hours. And I thought it was cool that Harvard did the study, and it was cool that the New York Times published it.
Right. I remember when the pandemic was going on, I early on, I was seeing a number of people post on social media about, all these kids who would be home now, and they didn't have the safe haven of school. They would be abused or, but that's a complete other side of the story that I hadn't heard until just right now. I was unaware of that.
The positive side, exactly, is that a lot of families actually enjoyed having more time with each other. And I'll give you one of my personal anecdote from my book. One of my graduate students is married to an IT professional. And during the pandemic, he worked from home. And because he was just physically present more, he decided he would be the one to make lunch for the family every day. And he was more involved with the homeschooling. He could take over some of those tasks. He would be the one to take the kids to soccer practice or choir practice. He picked up so many of the family responsibilities that his wife was able to start a part-time business. And the whole family benefited from the added income. So of course I interviewed her husband, and he said, our life is so much more balanced now. I am never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle. And then the final kicker was, he said, the time that I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife every morning.
Wow.
So those kind of anecdotes really show what can happen with this more flexibility for fathers to be involved with their families.
On that note, I know you do cultural apologetics. You mentioned this couple's now praying together, and I'm wondering how how does Christianity offer a unique perspective on masculinity that differs from these secular viewpoints?
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of stumbled across when I was writing the book was sociological studies of Christian men. And the reason they did the studies is because Christian men are targeted. They are presented as, exhibit A of toxic masculinity. It is said that if a man, believes in any form of male headship or authority, that will turn him into an overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarch. And so the sociologists and the psychologists said, well, is that true? They were listening to these accusations and saying, well, where's your evidence? Where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I cite about a dozen different studies in the book. And to my surprise, as much as anyone's, evangelical Christian men who are committed, authentic, Christians who attend church regularly, test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. They do interview the wives. I always get asked that. So yes, they do interview the wives. And the wives say that their wives test out as the happiest with their husband's treatment of them. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular fathers. Evangelical couples have a lower rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And these fathers have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So the data has completely debunked the media narrative, the secular accusations. I'll give you a quote. Sometimes it's helpful to crystallize the idea with a single quote. So the person who did the largest study is a sociologist named Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. So this was from a New York Times article that he wrote. And he put it this way, direct quote: "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages." And and why the reason they talk about the wives, of course, is the assumption is that these marriages are oppressive to the wives. So that's why he focuses. No, actually, these women test out as the happiest of all wives in America. And then he turns to his secular colleagues, because sociology tends to be a more secularized discipline than others. And he says academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. He said the evangelical Protestant married men with children are consistently the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. Wow. So this isn't just, a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings. And we should be very confident about bringing them both into the church and into the public square. It's not in the church yet, by the way. I had to go digging in the academic literature. If you read this, the endnotes in my book, you'll see they're all, academic papers from academic journals. So we need to get this out there where it can encourage and support and affirm the Christian men who are doing a good job.
Yeah, speaking of that, I'm wondering, aside from the book, or in addition to the book rather, what advice do you have for men who are struggling to find a positive and constructive form of masculinity in a culture that is always labeling it as toxic, or at least often labeling it as toxic?
Yeah, well, one reason I love the sociological data is that it reaffirms that living God's way makes you happier, healthier, gives you a better marriage, gives you a happier family. So it reinforces that God's way does actually work best. And the other side of the coin, by the way, that we really should mention is that men who are not committed Christians, but who claim the Christian label, actually do very poorly. So what happened was people would often push back. They do this to me. They'll push back by saying, yeah, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture?
Right.
And so the sociologists, the researchers went back to the data, and they made that very crucial separation between men who actually attend church regularly, who are committed to their faith, versus nominal Christians. And here in America, we have a lot of nominal people because they've been raised in a church, they've been raised in a Christian family, but they attend church rarely, if at all. And these men test out dramatically different. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They actually have a higher rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular couples. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. The same Brad Wilcox that I quoted before wrote an article for Christianity Today in which he said, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men. By the way, in case people don't know the word nominal, my students don't know the word nominal, so I have to tell them NOM is Latin for name, and so it means in name only. And so nominal Christian men, what Christian men need to realize is that they're just sort of hanging around the fringes of the church and claiming an evangelical identity. That's not going to be what pays off in terms of a happy marriage and a healthy family. Those men actually test out worse than secular men. So there's a real danger in knowing a little bit of the truth, but not acting on it. And I think that's the message that churches have to figure out. How do we encourage and support the men who are doing well? Get this data out there to help them. But how do we reach out to these men who are on the fringes and create a better discipleship program? Because they're the ones who are ruining the reputation of evangelical men, we might say, because people who know these men are the ones who are saying, well, evangelical men or Christian men are the most toxic. Well, that's because they're probably interacting with nominal Christian men. So we need a strategy within our churches for how to approach that and draw them in and disciple them.
Another trend that I've noticed recently, in the last few years especially, men have increasingly been turning to folks like Jordan Peterson as a sort of beacon of intellectuality and masculinity, and he gives his rules for life. And then they turn to other people like Joe Rogan to tap into sort of this martial arts masculinity and smoking cigars and this sort of thing. And so there does seem to be, at least within the culture, a spirit of men seeking after masculinity and sort of grasping for it. And so I think you're right that the church needs to do a better job. And the question is how. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? Or have you noticed those trends too with like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, one of my graduate students is now teaching at a high school. And she wrote me an email and said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate.
Right.
They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook.
Right.
I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school.
Wow.
So you are right. Especially younger men are reaching out to, well, if the church isn't helping them, they're going to reach out to these online influencers. Right. And there was a fascinating study that I put it at the front of my book because, Michael, you'll appreciate this. This has been the most controversial book I've written. And I just didn't expect that. Because my previous book was called Love Thy Body, and it was on issues of abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism. I thought that would be more controversial. But this has sparked far more controversy. Masculinity is more controversial than those other topics. So what I did is to kind of meet that controversy at the very beginning of the book, I put this study. It was done by a sociologist. He's not a Christian, but he's well known, and so he speaks all around the world. And he came up with a very clever experiment. He would ask young men 2 questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing things like duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I like that one. Be responsible, be a provider, be a protector. And so he would say, where'd you learn that? And the young men would say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. And I would say, they're made in God's image.
Right.
No matter what the culture is, they're made in God's image. And they do have this inherent, innate knowledge that their unique masculine strengths are not given them to get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, to care for those that they love. But his follow-up question then was, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so this sociologist concluded that men are actually sort of trapped between these 2 opposing scripts. They have this innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man, and I think we should be encouraged by that. I find that incredibly encouraging. Instead of accusing men of being toxic, most men don't respond very well to that. Instead, can we tap into this innate, inherent knowledge that they have, Christian or not, of what it means to be a good man? And then, on the other hand, we need to address, what this sociologist called the real man is kind of the Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? And so we have to help men think critically about that script. And so I kind of set up my whole book on, how men do have a sense of the biblical norms for masculinity. But they need help in thinking critically about the secular script that has emerged and that is, like you note, has become popular with a lot of even young Christian men. How can we train them to think more critically about what the secular world is saying?
Yes. I'm not sure. We might have dropped or froze there for a second, but I think, you look at Andrew Tate, you look at Jordan Peterson, you look at Joe Rogan, and then I look at somebody like John Eldridge, who, moves in Christian circles, and, he seems to be tapping into this like desire for masculinity too. He's, you film documentaries about motorcycle rides across the countrysides, and he started this campfire initiative. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
No, I'm not actually.
the idea
I've read his books.
yeah, he started this new initiative, and it's taking off like wildfire, pun intended, but it's this campfire initiative. And the whole idea is that people start campfires wherever they live, and men in the area are invited to come and just sit around a campfire and talk. And so you can go to the website and see a map of the United States now,
Yeah.
and you can find a campfire in your local area and sign up to go to it and just sit around the fire with men and talk. And so just something as simple as that, right? Tapping into this desire to be around other good men and to do something masculine, healthy masculinity, yeah. And I think that as far as like I can see is one of the most practical ways that this is being implemented in church circles that I've seen.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I have had men that I know, men that I work with, sometimes feel as if the emphasis tends to be on just the ultra masculine things, go hunting and white water rafting, mountain climbing, and I one of my colleagues at Houston Christian University said, "Well, what if I'd like to go to an art museum?" In other words, it still is. I think it's a good thing, but it's still kind of emphasizing just one aspect of masculinity, and it often it's playing a little bit off of a 19th century meme. There was a late 19th century meme where there was with the Industrial Revolution, for the first time, men were not using their physical strength, on the farm, and they were ending up sitting at desks all day. And so, of course, there was a lot of concern already back then. This is when organized sports got started. Did you know that? This is when football started. Basketball started. You know how basketball started? A Presbyterian preacher wanted something that men could do indoors during the winter. And there were 2 baskets of peaches in the church. And they used these peach baskets and put one on each side. And he invented the game of basketball. All this was happening in the 19th century. So there was concern. Here's how they put it. The word was over-civilized. People felt like boys were no longer growing up hardy, strong, healthy on the farm. They were growing up in the city, and they were having desk jobs. And the word that was used was over-civilized. Our men have become over-civilized. And so there was a strong tendency to say, well, they need to get away from civilization. They should go out, go west, young man. That they should. The first Western was called the Virginian. Did you ever read Westerns? The first Western was called the Virginian. It's about a man who recovered his true masculinity by going out west and to Wyoming and living with the cowboys and roping cattle and sleeping under the stars. So most of the male fiction of the late 19th century all featured men who went out into the wilderness, into the mountains with the cowboys or out to sea. It all emphasized that ultra masculine side. So in some ways, John Eldredge is Christianizing that theme, but it's a little bit limited still. In my book, what I do is, I think there's some danger in the 19th century theme, because what it said is you recover your true manhood by getting away from your family, by getting away from women, by getting away from civilization. The over-civilized meant that the solution seemed to be to escape from civilization and go out and, be rough and tough and wild. I think that can lead to men thinking that, being embedded in their family and their marriage is not masculine. You know what I mean? If masculinity is getting away, then being, with your family can be emasculating. In fact, if you read John Eldredge's book, he literally says, right in the beginning of the book, he says, Adam was not created in the garden. He was created outside the garden, and therefore he's never going to be content in the garden. Eve was created in the garden, so she's domestic. But Adam will never be truly domestic. Well, I have a problem with that. First of all, you might have a problem with the exegesis. Yeah. But it also suggests that somehow home and family are not intrinsic to the male character. And I would go back instead to Genesis 1, to what theologians call the cultural mandate. And not every theological tradition uses that term. But cultural mandate is a term that's used often of the verse that says, God created the first human couple, right? And what's the first thing he says to them? What's your purpose? Why did I make you? Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. Be fruitful and multiply doesn't, just mean the nuclear family. Anthropologists tell us all the social institutions grow ultimately out of the family. It becomes a clan, a tribe, a nation. And you need groups that do specific purposes. You need a state, a church, a school, a marketplace. And so what it really means is create the whole social environment, all of the social institutions that make up a society. And subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So again, most cultures start with agriculture, but mining, technology, inventing computers, composing music. One of my students said, oh, come on, composing music? Well, I play the violin. So I said, what's the violin made out of? wood, and the bow, horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with harnessing the natural resources that God has built into creation. And so theologians call it the cultural mandate because it means God's original purpose for the human race was to create cultures, create civilizations. And I think that men need that message in particular because it really addresses their need for a sense of achievement and accomplishment and impact, which men tend to have a little bit more than women. And so I think the best solution for the biblical message should be calling men back to the cultural mandate and saying you don't recover your authentic masculinity by escaping off to the wilderness. Not that there's anything wrong with the wilderness, it's just not how you find your true masculinity. It becomes a kind of escape. You find your authentic masculinity by rolling up your sleeves and getting deeply invested in your family and in creative and productive work that serves God and serves your community.
Wow. Wow. Well, this has been such a delight to talk to you. I'm wondering as we sort of wind down here, are there any upcoming projects or books or anything like that you're working on or that you'd like to share here or yeah.
You've caught me at an awkward moment because I've always known as I was finishing one book, I always knew what I wanted to do next. And this is the first time I haven't really known. I will tell you that I think the biggest threat to religious liberty in our day is the rise of globalism. Global entities like WHO, World Health Organization, and the WEF, and even transnational corporations that want to dissolve national boundaries and impose, single rule on all nations. I think that's a big threat to religious liberty that's coming up, and I'd sort of like to address that. But that's sort of the cutting edge issues that we're dealing with today.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's huge. I think like transhumanism seems to be
Exactly.
a thing. Yeah, like that's really coming into focus as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Right. Transhumanism is a big part of it. And it does tie into my earlier book, Love Thy Body, because
Yeah.
what we were talking about earlier, that transgenderism is a rejection of the body,
Yeah.
of the biology. And transhumanism is completely a rejection of biology. The idea that we're going to transcend biology, that we will be liberated from the limitations of biology. So yeah, you're right. There are actually writers, transhumanist writers, who argue specifically that transhumanism is a sort of the next step after transgenderism. So that's their own view as well.
Yeah. Well, Nancy, it has been just such a pleasure to meet you, and I'm just blessed to be able to discuss this with you. And I want everyone who's watching or listening this to go pick up The Toxic War on Masculinity. You can find that on Amazon and other places. Check out Nancy's website. Check out just Google her name. You'll find all sorts of great stuff. Excellent books. And there's enough to read there for quite a while. And I'm so thankful. For those of you who are watching or listening, go check out glossahouse.com as well. Lots of great resources there. And the ProveText podcast, Glossa House TV, all that. But Nancy, it's so nice to meet you, and blessings to you on your writing ministry, your teaching ministry, your various other ministries. Thanks so much for this. I'm really grateful.
Well, thank you. And I perused your website a bit, to find out who you are. And I appreciate the work you're doing, especially teaching Greek and Hebrew. I love that.
Yes.
You're putting it out in small bite-sized pieces so that people can actually learn it.
Right.
I like that. You've been
Appreciate
very creative.
Yes, trying to make Greek and Hebrew, Latin more accessible to people, and yeah, recovering a deep and abiding love for those biblical languages, those ancient languages. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. That's encouraging to hear. So friends, we will wrap it up there. Yeah, we're gonna stop here and say we hope that helps. All right. Let's
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.